There are some kinds of quiet that aren't peaceful. The kind that sits in a hospital corridor at 2004-7 in the morning when the overhead fluorescents hum just slightly too loud and the linoleum smells of disinfectant and old rubber. That kind of quiet has weight to it. It presses. It remembers things. And on the third floor of Mercy General's trauma ward, a woman who had learned a long time ago to read silence the way other people read faces stood at the charge desk, going through intake forms with the particular stillness of someone who has trained herself not to flinch. Her name was Claire Merritt, 34 years old, 5 feet 7 inches of what looked, to anyone watching, like unremarkable competence. Her blonde hair was gathered into a low bun at the nape of her neck, a few loose strands falling against her jaw. Her eyes were the pale blue-gray of lake water in autumn, and in the fluorescent wash of the ward, they looked simply tired, which she was, 4 hours into a 12-hour night shift. She wore clean blue V-neck scrubs, a simple silver wristwatch on her left wrist that was adjusted too precisely for habit. And she had the particular kind of focused posture that people who've spent years managing chaos often develop, back straight without being rigid weights, slightly forward peripheral vision doing more work than the eyes directly ahead. She was, as far as anyone on that floor was concerned, exactly what the badge on her chest said she was. Charge nurse, 3rd floor trauma, been here 3 years. If you are watching this story to the end, I want you to know right now that wristwatch matters. Remember it. The patient in room 31T had been admitted 36 hours earlier under a name that wasn't his. He was 31 years old, and if you looked at the chart, it said blunt force chest trauma, bilateral rib fractures, collapsed lung. What the chart didn't say was that he had witnessed a federal arms broker hand documents to a sitting state senator in a parking garage in Charlotte, and that the 2 men who'd confirmed his identity 12 hours later had not been law enforcement. He was here under protective custody. His name on every form was Daniel Webb. One federal marshal, a man named Rios, sat in a chair outside his room reading the same magazine he'd been holding since 9 p.m. Claire had noted 3 things about Marshal Rios when she checked on him at midnight. He was good at looking relaxed. He never actually turned a page. And when she had passed within 2 feet of him, his eyes had tracked her without his head moving. She'd said nothing. She'd checked the IV drip in 312, noted the patient was asleep, and gone back to the charge desk. This was her way, noting things, filing them, not needing to act on them immediately. Some habits never leave. At 3:11 a.m., the elevator at the far end of the corridor opened, and 4 people stepped out. Claire didn't look up from her intake screen immediately. She heard the difference first, the way the footsteps spread out rather than staying together, the absence of the soft shoe shuffle that visitors and orderlies made the sound of heavier soles moving with a practiced weight-forward discipline that she recognized below the level of language, somewhere older, somewhere that had been educated under very different conditions than nursing school. When she did look up, she registered the following in approximately 2 seconds. 2 men in maintenance uniforms that fit too well across the shoulders and too loosely at the wrists. 2 more in what appeared to be hospital visitor credentials, lanyards purchased or stolen from the ground floor. All 4 had their faces partially obscured. Surgical masks, the kind everyone had grown accustomed to seeing post-pandemic and no longer looked twice at. All 4 were moving toward the stairwell door and the nurses' station simultaneously, which meant they were splitting a space they had already studied. Claire's hand moved to the desk phone. It never reached it. The one nearest her, heavy-set, calm, a flat brown mask over a blunt face, put a hand over the receiver before her fingers touched it. He didn't shout, he didn't wave a weapon. He simply looked at her with the particular absence of emotion that meant he had rehearsed this part and said quietly, "Don't." The gun materialized at the level of the desk, below the sight line of the corridor security camera. A small, suppressed semi-automatic held with the muzzle indexed down toward the desk surface rather than at her, which told her something about his training. He'd been taught to point it at the problem, not at witnesses he didn't need to use yet. "Where is he?" the man said, still quiet. 312? She said nothing. "We know which room. I'm asking you as a courtesy. You want to keep your people safe. You stay here, you stay quiet, and nobody on this floor gets hurt." The second man had already moved past her, down the corridor, toward 31, Dr. 2000, Dr. Chica. Raymond Holt arrived on the floor at 30:14, which was either the worst or best timing possible. He was 52, silver-haired, with the kind of confident stride that came from 20 years of being the highest-ranked person in every room he entered. He had been paged by the night resident about a procedure adjustment, a completely separate patient, nothing to do with 312, and he walked off the elevator into what looked initially like a quiet corridor with a slightly tense woman standing at the charge desk and a large man in maintenance standing beside it. He did not read it correctly. Claire, he barely slowed. Why is there someone at the desk? What's... Doctor. The man near Claire turned, unhurried. The gun was gone, back in the waistband. Maintenance issue. We need everyone to stay put while we deal with a gas line concern. Hospital protocol won't take long. Holt looked at Claire, and Claire, holding the eyes of a man who had just watched her reach for a phone and been stopped, made a decision that she had been trained in another life. To make cleanly and without hesitation, she kept her face neutral. She gave Holt nothing, and she said, "Dr. Holt, maintenance has the corridor." Holt read it as administrative nuisance. He was already irritated. He turned to the maintenance man and said, "I have a patient to see. It'll be quick, sir." "Then be quick." Holt turned to Claire. "When they're done, page me. And can someone get me an updated chart on 317? Your floor admin has been... I'll pull it." Claire moved toward the secondary workstation, which was 8 feet farther from the armed man than the charge desk. The armed man tracked her but let her go because she was moving away from the elevator, away from the stairwell, toward a harmless terminal. What she was actually doing was counting. 2 men in 312's direction, 1 at the charge desk, 1, and she hadn't seen the 4th since the entry split, which meant the 4th had gone to the stairwell, which meant they had sealed both the elevator and the stairwell exit, which meant they had a window between them. They were professionals, but they were professionals doing a contained job, not a hostile building clear. They weren't here to kill nurses. They were here to finish one person and leave before a federal check-in at 4 a.m. She'd seen Rios check his phone at 11, at 1, and at 3, which meant he reported on the hour, which meant they had 49 minutes from entry to the next contact pulse. Her shift team tonight was 2 junior nurses and an overnight tech. The tech, Marcus, was in the supply room at the far end. The junior nurses, Priya and Danny, were both in patient rooms, neither aware yet. The armed man near the charge desk was watching Holt, who had begun to push the issue about getting to his patient, and was doing so with the particular oblivious confidence of a man who did not believe anything truly dangerous could happen to him. "I need you to understand," Holt said, voice rising slightly, "that I am the attending physician on this floor and I have a patient in 317 who—" "Sir." The man's tone had an edge now. "Don't sir me." "Claire, call security. Dr. Holt." Claire had turned from the workstation. Her voice was very calm. Not calm in the way frightened people go quiet. Calm in the specific, lower register, slower way that people use when they need someone else to stop moving. "Please listen to me." He turned to her with the mild exasperation of a man who had spent 2 decades dismissing nurses when they interrupted him. "It's not a gas line," she said. The maintenance man took 2 steps toward her. Holt went pale. And Claire, watching the angle of the gun reappear, did the thing she had spent 3 years on this floor learning not to do. She stopped being only a nurse. She moved left, not back. Not toward the stairwell, not toward the elevator, but left and slightly forward, which put her inside the man's natural reaction arc before he'd recalibrated his feet. She caught his right wrist with both hands. Not in the way self-defense courses taught in community centers, but in the way that involved a very specific mechanical leverage point just above the wrist joint that, when applied with the right hip rotation, produced a controlled downward break that was non-lethal, extremely painful, and took approximately 1.4 seconds. The gun dropped. She had it before it cleared the knee-level drop. Holt, to his credit, ran. She did not stop him. She needed him gone from this corridor, not in it. The man on the floor looked up at her with the recalibrated expression of someone who has just had their situational model overturned at high speed, and she said, very quietly, "On your stomach, fingers laced." She said it exactly the way it had been said to her 10 years ago in an echoing gym in Fort Benning, Georgia, by a sergeant instructor who had the patience of geology and the emotional range of a man who had watched too many people die badly. She had said it cleanly enough that the man complied. What happened in the next 19 minutes would be, later, described in multiple after-action reports in language that was precise, procedural, and almost entirely devoid of the emotional texture of what it felt like to do those things. It felt like this, like walking back into a room you thought you'd closed forever and finding all the furniture exactly where you left it. Like a particular kind of grief that arrives not as sadness but as fluency, a terrible, practiced ease that you'd spent years trying to forget you possessed. She moved through the trauma ward the way water finds its level, not fast, not dramatic, with an economy of motion that only exists in people who have been trained to move quietly in dangerous spaces and then spent 10 years more moving quietly in clinical ones. She found Marcus in the supply room, kept him there, gave him 3 instructions in 12 words. She located Priya and Danny, moved them to the medication room, secured the door from the outside. She came up the left corridor toward 31 the long way, using the blind angle she'd identified from the entry pattern. The 2 men approaching the room hadn't accounted for the maintenance access junction 30 feet before the room, because they'd studied the floor plan digitally, and the junction was a structural addition from 2019 that hadn't been updated in the building's digital schematics. She'd known about it because she'd helped the contractor's crew navigate the ward during a renovation. Marshal Rios was not in his chair. The chair was on its side. The magazine was on the floor. She stopped, listened. The door to 312 was closed. She could hear from inside 2 distinct movement signatures and 1 voice, not Rios's, not the patient's, conducting what sounded like a directed conversation with someone they needed a response from. Rios, she calculated, was either incapacitated inside or had been moved. She needed to know before she went through that door. She didn't go through the door, she went through the wall. Not literally. Through the connecting hygiene access panel that adjoined the room used for equipment storage, which shared a wall with 312 and had been installed with the service pass through that the renovation crew had never properly sealed, and which she had reported to facilities management twice in the last year, and which facilities had not yet addressed. The patient was conscious. He was also terrified, which was appropriate. One of the 2 men was at the bedside, the other near the window with a phone pressed to his ear, likely coordinating the timing with the 4th man at the stairwell. Rios was on the floor. Alive, she could see his chest moving, but not functional. She had a suppressed semi-automatic 8 rounds, no backup, and a man at a window who would turn when she entered. She waited 3 seconds, let the man on the phone complete a half sentence, then moved. She did not discharge the weapon. She used it differently. She used it the way a trained, close-quarters operator uses an acquired firearm when the objective is not to escalate, but to contain, as a tool of compliance, an authority object, a physical statement of geometrically superior position. She had the room secured in 41 seconds. She would not describe what that meant in detail, then or later. She never did. At 4:03 a.m., the federal check-in at Mercy General's 3rd floor produced a discrepancy, and the response team arrived at 4021. They came up the stairwell, the right stairwell, not the sealed one, because she had released the 4th man to the left fire exit at approximately 30:38 after disabling his means of communication, which gave him a choice between disappearing into the night or staying to be the last thing law enforcement found, and he had made the predictable choice. The federal team lead was a woman named Sandra Park, 40 years old, who had a way of moving through rooms that Claire recognized from the inside out, the particular sweeping peripheral scan, the weight check at every doorway, the 2-finger count of visible exits before speaking. She came through the ward's double doors at speed, assessed the secured corridor, the 3 restrained individuals, the weapon on the charge desk, and the charge nurse standing at the end of it, and she stopped. She didn't stop the way people stop when they are surprised. She stopped the way people stop when they have just run the math and arrived at an answer they should have considered much earlier. Sergeant Merritt, she said. Not a question, not a greeting, exactly. More like the verbal equivalent of setting something down carefully. Dr. Cream. Holt, who had returned to the floor with building security and 2 very confused police officers and had been watching the federal team's arrival from the elevator bay, turned. He looked at Sandra Park. He looked at the 3 restrained men. He looked at Marshal Rios, who was sitting up against the wall of 312 with a cold pack against his jaw and who had, in the last 4 minutes, Been watching Claire Merritt with the specific expression of a man reconstructing events in a new and significantly more humbling order. He looked at Claire. She was at the charge desk. She had her clipboard. She was already filling out the incident documentation because the paperwork was going to be enormous and someone had to start it, and starting it was the job of the charge nurse. "You know her?" Holt said to Park. Park was already moving past him. "She led the Kandahar evac in 2016, Park said, not breaking stride. 14 personnel under fire, 0 casualties. After that, she was assigned to the 75th for 2 more years before she ETS'd. Holt said nothing. There was nothing in his vocabulary for what he was currently experiencing. Later, much later, after the statements and the federal documentation and the calls that had to be made, and after Marcus had made terrible coffee that everyone drank without complaint because it was something normal to do, Claire sat in the break room with both hands around a mug and the particular quality of tired that isn't physical. It was the tired that came from having been, for approximately 90 minutes, something she had spent 3 years very carefully not being. She was not angry. She was not triumphant. She felt, if anything, the quiet sadness of someone who has just confirmed that a door they thought was closed is still operable, and that part of them had not entirely minded walking back through it, and that she wasn't sure what that meant about the life she'd been trying to build on this side. Priya came in, still shaken, still processing. She sat across from Claire and for a moment said nothing. Then, "Were you scared?" Claire looked at her mug. "I was scared when I was 22, she said, "and 3 men were dead, and I had to figure out how to get 11 others back to the FOB with 1 vehicle and 2 of them critical." She paused. After that, it was more like, "Bots, moth." Priya didn't know what to say to that. Neither of them did, really. In the federal report filed the following week, the 3rd-floor charge nurse at Mercy General was identified as a person of interest, then a cooperative witness. Then, in a quietly amended footnote, a material security asset whose actions had directly preserved the life of a protected witness under conditions that exceeded the scope of hospital personnel expectations. It was worded with the careful bureaucratic distance of people who needed to acknowledge something without fully reckoning with what it meant. She read it in the break room, on her lunch break, in clean blue scrubs, with her silver wristwatch on her left wrist. She set it down. She finished her coffee. She went back to work. There's a specific kind of quiet in a hospital at 6 a.m. when the night shift is ending and the day hasn't fully started and the fluorescents are just beginning to feel less merciless. Claire moved through it the way she always did, checking charts, verifying handoffs, making sure the night's ledger balanced. She didn't need anyone to understand what she'd done, or why, or what it had cost her over the years to get here and stay here and build something quieter than what she'd come from. She just needed the ward to function, the patients to be safe, the next shift to come in on time. That was the job. It had always been the job, just the shape of the uniform had changed. In room 340, a man named Daniel Webb, who wasn't Daniel Webb, opened his eyes to morning light, and the vital signs monitor beeped in its steady, faithful rhythm. And the corridor outside was quiet in the good way, the way that means everyone who should be alive still is. Some people carry their history like armor, some carry it like a wound that never quite closed. Claire Merritt had figured out somewhere between Kandahar and this fluorescent-lit corridor that hers was simply part of her, neither trophy nor burden, just the specific weight of a life that had been lived at a particular intensity for a particular reason. She had stopped needing people to know. The ones who mattered always figured it out eventually. If this story stayed with you, the restraint, the cost, the quiet kind of extraordinary that never announces itself, there are others like it here. You don't have to do anything right now except decide whether you want to keep watching. Most people who found this one didn't regret it.